The earliest written narratives known to humanity were not carved into stone as monuments to kings or gods, but pressed into soft clay tablets in the ancient cities of Sumer, around 3200 BC. These first stories, preserved in cuneiform script and excavated from the ruins of Uruk, Nippur and Eridu, contain startling accounts that challenge our understanding of human origins and early civilization. Unlike the gradual evolution of writing from simple pictographs to complex narratives that conventional archaeology expects, these texts appear fully formed, displaying sophisticated literary structures, complex theological concepts, and detailed cosmological knowledge that seems to emerge without preceding developmental stages. What makes these earliest written stories particularly intriguing is their consistent focus on a specific theme: the interaction between divine beings who descended from the heavens and primitive humanity who received from these beings the fundamental elements of civilization itself. The Epic of Atrahasis, preserved on tablets dating to approximately 1700 BC, but clearly based on much earlier Sumerian sources, provides the most detailed account of human creation found in ancient literature. Unlike later simplified creation myths, this early narrative reads like a technical manual, describing the process by which divine beings called the Anunnaki created humanity through what the text terms the mixing of clay with divine essence. Archaeological investigation of the sites where these tablets were discovered reveals that Sumerian civilization appeared with remarkable suddenness, displaying advanced urban planning, sophisticated irrigation systems, complex mathematical knowledge, and astronomical precision that conventional models of gradual cultural development struggle to explain. The stories themselves claim to preserve memories of actual events, describing not metaphorical spiritual truths, but concrete historical interactions between advanced beings and early humans who were transformed from primitive laborers into civilized peoples capable of building the first cities. The ancient Sumerian text known as the Eridu Genesis, discovered in fragmentary form on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, but clearly based on much earlier sources, provides the oldest written account of human creation known to archaeology. Unlike later Hebrew or Greek creation myths, this primordial narrative presents the creation of humanity not as a divine gift, but as a practical solution to a labor crisis among the gods themselves. The text, preserved on tablets catalogued as CBS 10673 and CBS 10674 in the University of Pennsylvania collection, describes in matter-of-fact administrative language how the lesser gods called the Agigi had rebelled against harsh working conditions imposed by their superiors, forcing the creation of a new worker species that could perform necessary tasks while freeing the divine beings for more important work. The tablets preserving the Eridu Genesis were excavated from the ruins of Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions conducted between 1888 and 1900 under the direction of John Punnett Peters and Hermann Hilprecht. The fragmentary nature of these tablets initially obscured their significance, with key portions of the narrative missing or damaged beyond reconstruction. However, subsequent discoveries of parallel texts from other Mesopotamian sites enabled scholars to reconstruct substantial portions of the original composition. The text itself exhibits linguistic features that identify it as belonging to the earliest phase of Sumerian literary development, including archaic grammatical constructions and vocabulary that fell out of use by the time the surviving copies were produced around 1700 BC. What distinguishes the Eridu Genesis from later creation accounts is its pragmatic tone and focus on practical problems requiring concrete solutions. The narrative begins not with cosmic chaos or divine contemplation, but with a description of the hard labor required to maintain the irrigation canals, build temples, and extract minerals from the earth. The text states that the Agigi gods carried the work basket, and that the work was heavy and the distress was much. This description reads like a labor dispute report rather than theological poetry, documenting grievances about working conditions with the same bureaucratic precision found in administrative tablets recording grain rations or construction projects. The rebellion of the Agigi receives detailed treatment in the text, describing how these lesser divine beings threw down their tools, set fire to their implements, and marched to the gate of Enlil's temple to demand relief from their labours. The specific mention of tool abandonment and fire setting indicates a deliberate work stoppage rather than passive resistance, suggesting the text preserves memory of an actual crisis that threatened the continuation of essential operations. The response of the senior gods to this crisis, according to the narrative, involved a council meeting where various solutions were proposed and debated before settling on the creation of humanity as the optimal resolution. The creation process described in the Eridu Genesis involves the goddess Nintur, also called Ninmah in other texts, working in cooperation with the god Enki to produce the first humans. The text specifies that birth goddesses were assembled and that they kneaded clay from above the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth that served as Enki's domain. This reference to clay from a specific location suggests that the material used in human creation possessed particular properties that distinguished it from ordinary earth. The involvement of multiple birth goddesses in the creation process indicates a systematic production operation rather than a single miraculous event, consistent with the text's overall pragmatic approach to describing divine activities. Archaeological evidence from Eridu itself, the city whose name the text bears, reveals occupation layers extending back to approximately 5800 BC, making it one of the earliest permanently settled sites in southern Mesopotamia. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 uncovered 17 distinct building levels at the site's primary temple complex, with the deepest layers revealing architectural sophistication that appears fully developed rather than showing gradual evolution from simpler structures. The precision of foundation layouts, the sophisticated drainage systems, and the astronomical alignments incorporated into even the earliest temple levels suggest access to advanced engineering knowledge from the beginning of the site's occupation. The Eridu Genesis explicitly identifies this ancient city as the first to be created, stating that kingship descended from heaven and that the kingship was in Eridu. This phraseology, using descent terminology rather than development or establishment language, reinforces the text's presentation of civilization as something introduced from an external source, rather than emerging through indigenous human innovation. The subsequent portions of the text describe the establishment of 4 additional cities, each receiving divine oversight and administrative structure, creating a network of urban centers that together constituted the foundation of Sumerian civilization. The Epic of Atrahasis, composed around 1700 BC during the Old Babylonian period, preserves the most technically detailed account of human creation found in any ancient literature. The text, recovered from multiple sites including Sippar and Nineveh, describes a sophisticated process involving the goddess Nintu working under the direction of Enki to create humanity through biological procedures that read remarkably like genetic engineering protocols. The epic specifies that 14 pieces of clay were prepared, 7 to become males and 7 to become females, with each piece implanted with what the text calls divine essence, extracted from the blood of a slain god named King, who possessed intelligence and wisdom that would be transferred to the new beings. The most complete version of the Atrahasis Epic was recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, excavated by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the mid-19th century. The text exists on 3 tablets that together preserve approximately 1,200 lines of poetry, though substantial portions remain lost or damaged. Additional fragments from Old Babylonian sites, including Sippar and Babylon, have enabled scholars to reconstruct earlier versions of the epic that predate the Assyrian copies by over 1,000 years. Comparison between these different versions reveals remarkable consistency in the technical details of human creation, suggesting that the account was transmitted with unusual precision across many centuries. The Atrahasis narrative provides specific procedural details that distinguish it from other ancient creation accounts. The text describes how Nintu pinched off 14 pieces of clay, placing 7 on the right and 7 on the left. Each piece was then mixed with the blood of Weil, a god who possessed intelligence, which had been prepared through a ritual slaughter performed specifically to obtain this divine genetic material. The text emphasizes that this god possessed personality, suggesting that the qualities defining individual consciousness were understood to reside in biological substances that could be extracted and transferred to other beings. Modern genetic research has revealed that specific personality traits, cognitive capabilities, and behavioral tendencies do indeed have biological foundations that can be inherited through genetic transmission. The Atrahasis Epic's focus on transferring intelligence and personality through biological material demonstrates understanding of hereditary mechanisms that would not be scientifically validated until the 20th century. The precision with which the text describes these procedures, including the separation of male and female forms and the equal distribution of genetic material across 14 individual creations, suggests documentation of an actual biological engineering process rather than mythological speculation. The epic continues with a description of the gestation period for these newly created beings, stating that the womb goddesses were assigned and that birth goddesses were brought together. The text specifies that when 10 months had passed, they opened the womb, and describes Nintu's joy at the successful creation. This 10-month gestation period matches the actual human pregnancy duration more closely than the simplified 9-month figure commonly cited, demonstrating the text's attention to biological accuracy. The involvement of multiple birth goddesses in gestating the 14 clay pieces suggests that the creation process involves surrogate pregnancy, with each goddess carrying one or two of the proto-humans to term. The purposes for which humanity was created receive explicit treatment in the Atrahasis Epic. The text states that the work of the gods was imposed on humanity, and that humans were created to bear the labour of the gods. This utilitarian approach to human creation, presenting it as a solution to divine workforce problems rather than the pinnacle of cosmic purpose, contrasts sharply with later theological traditions that emphasized humanity's special spiritual status. The Atrahasis account treats human creation as an engineering project designed to produce workers with specific capabilities optimized for particular tasks. The results of this creation project, according to the epic, exceeded the expectations of the divine administrators. The text describes humanity multiplying rapidly, spreading across the land, and becoming so numerous that their noise disturbed the gods. This population growth problem eventually led to attempted reductions of human numbers through plague and famine, before culminating in the flood that nearly eliminated humanity entirely. The systematic nature of these population control measures and the detailed descriptions of their implementation suggest that the text preserves memories of actual demographic management programs rather than purely mythological narrative. The Sumerian King List, preserved on multiple tablets including the Weld-Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum, presents one of history's most perplexing chronological documents. This ancient text, composed around 2100 BC, but drawing from much earlier sources, divides Sumerian rulers into two distinct categories: those who ruled before the Great Flood and those who came after. The antediluvian kings are credited with reigns of extraordinary duration, some lasting tens of thousands of years, recorded with the same bureaucratic precision used for documenting grain distributions and livestock counts. The tablet states that after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, providing the first city as the original seat of divine administration on earth. The Weld-Blundell prism, discovered by Herbert Weld-Blundell during excavations at Lhasa in 1923, represents the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian King List. This clay prism, standing approximately 20 centimeters tall, contains 4 columns of text listing rulers from the mythical beginnings of Sumerian civilization through the Isin-Lhasa period around 1800 BC. The precision of the document's construction, with carefully ruled columns and meticulously inscribed characters, reflects the importance ancient scribes attached to preserving this chronological information accurately. The antediluvian section of the King List presents the most challenging data for conventional historical interpretation. The text begins by stating that after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, and proceeds to list 8 kings who ruled that city for a combined total of 241,200 years. The first king, Alulim, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years, while subsequent rulers receive similar or even longer reign durations. These figures appear not as round numbers or symbolic representations, but as precise calculations often given in the Sumerian sexagesimal system that used base 60 mathematics. The mathematical relationships between these antediluvian reign lengths reveal intriguing patterns that suggest systematic calculation rather than random invention. All the reign durations are multiples of 3600, a number the Sumerians called a sar, which served as a fundamental unit in their astronomical and mathematical systems. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8 sars, while other kings ruled for periods of 10, 12, or 13 sars. This consistent use of the Sa as a base unit for measuring antediluvian rains suggests that the figures represent actual time periods calculated according to specific astronomical or calendrical cycles rather than mythological exaggeration. The sudden shift in rain durations after the flood provides additional evidence that the King List preserves genuine historical traditions rather than purely legendary material. The first post-Diluvian rulers are credited with reigns, measured in hundreds rather than thousands of years, though still exceeding normal human lifespans according to modern biological understanding. The text states that after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, marking the beginning of a new phase in Sumerian political organization. The first king of post-Diluvian Kish, Gore, ruled for 1,200 years according to the list, while subsequent rulers show a gradual decline in reign durations approaching more conventional human timescales. Archaeological excavations at the cities mentioned in the King List have confirmed their extreme antiquity and revealed evidence consistent with the text's presentation of a sophisticated civilization existing in the distant past. Eridu, identified as the first royal city, shows occupation extending back to approximately 5800 BC with temple architecture, demonstrating advanced engineering from its earliest levels. Kish, listed as the first post-Diluvian royal seat, reveals occupation layers dating to the early dynastic period around 3200 BC, with flood deposits in lower strata that correspond to the King List chronological framework. The precision with which the King List maintains chronological continuity across multiple cities and dynasties demonstrates sophisticated record-keeping capabilities that required institutional structures for preserving information across centuries. The text tracks not only reign lengths, but also the transfer of kingship between cities, creating a comprehensive political history that encompasses the entire Sumerian world. This level of administrative sophistication appearing in texts dating to the early 2nd millennium BC, but claiming to preserve information from thousands of years earlier, raises fundamental questions about the institutional continuity of Sumerian civilization and the sources from which these scribes obtained their chronological data. Mesopotamian literature consistently references 7 primordial sages called the Apkallu, who served as advisors to antediluvian kings and established the foundations of Sumerian civilization. The earliest references to these beings appear in tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, describing them not as mythological figures but as actual entities who taught humanity the arts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and temple construction. The Babylonian priest-historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC but drawing from much earlier temple archives, describes the first of these sages, Huan, or Adapa, as an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf to instruct primitive humans in the principles of civilized life. The Apkallu tradition appears consistently across Mesopotamian literature spanning 3 millennia, suggesting preservation of genuine historical memories rather than later mythological invention. The earliest references appear in administrative texts from the Uruk IV period around 3200 BC, where the term Abgal, the Sumerian form of Apkallu, appears in contexts indicating these were recognized institutional figures rather than purely legendary beings. Later Akkadian texts from the Old Babylonian period provide more detailed accounts of the 7 sages, listing them by name and specifying their individual contributions to civilizational development. The Uruk list of kings and sages, a text dating to approximately 165 BC, but clearly based on much earlier sources, provides the most systematic enumeration of the antediluvian Apkallu and their associated kings. The document names the 7 sages as Uana, who corresponds to Yuan or Adapa in other sources, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Each sage is paired with a specific antediluvian king, indicating that they served as advisors to royal administrations rather than operating independently. The text specifies that these 7 Apkallu, who were Paradu or pristine, descended to earth before the flood. Berossus provides additional details about the first Apkallu that illuminate the nature of these primordial sages. His account, preserved in fragments quoted by later Greek historians, including Alexander Polyhister and Eusebius, describes how a creature named Oans, clearly the Greek form of Uana, emerged from the Erythraean Sea. which ancient sources identified as the Persian Gulf. Berossus states that this being possessed the body of a fish, but had grown beneath the fish's head a human head and feet similar to those of a man attached to the fish's tail. The precision of this anatomical description suggests Berossus was working from detailed source material, rather than vague legendary accounts. The technological knowledge attributed to the Apkallu encompasses the full range of skills necessary for establishing urban civilization. Temple texts describe how these sages taught humanity the principles of writing and mathematics, enabling the record-keeping essential for managing complex agricultural and economic systems. Astronomical knowledge transmitted by the Apkallu included the development of accurate calendars, the prediction of celestial events, and the calculation of long-term astronomical cycles, including the precession of equinoxes. Architectural and engineering instruction from these primordial teachers enabled the construction of ziggurats, irrigation canals, and urban infrastructure that characterized Sumerian civilization. The association of the Apkallu with water and their description as amphibious beings has led some scholars to interpret them as purely mythological personifications of aquatic deities. However, the consistent emphasis in ancient texts on their role as teachers of practical technologies and their pairing with historical kings suggest they represent actual entities rather than abstract symbols. The description of Oans emerging from the sea to teach and then returning to the water at night might preserve memories of beings who arrived by sea from a distant location and maintain their primary residence on ships or coastal installations while working with early human populations inland. The decline of the Apkallu tradition, according to Mesopotamian sources, occurred at the time of the flood when their direct involvement in human affairs ended. Later texts describe post-Diluvian sages called Ummanu who continued to serve as royal advisors, but these were explicitly identified as human, rather than possessing the divine or hybrid nature attributed to the antediluvian Apkallu. The systematic replacement of the primordial sages with human advisors marks a transition from direct instruction by advanced beings to human maintenance of inherited knowledge systems, a pattern that appears repeatedly in ancient traditions describing the gradual withdrawal of divine administrators from direct oversight of human civilization. The Sumerian composition known as Enki and the World Order provides detailed documentation of how divine administrators established the fundamental structures of human civilization following the creation of humanity. This text, preserved on tablets from Nippur and dating to approximately 2100 BC, describes Enki travelling throughout the known world to establish cities, organize agricultural systems, and appoint divine overseers for different geographical regions and economic activities. The poem reads less like religious mythology and more like an administrative report documenting the implementation of a comprehensive civilization-building program across multiple territories. The text of Enki and the World Order survives in multiple fragmentary copies excavated from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions. The most complete version, designated Ni 4574 in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum's collection, preserves approximately 375 lines of the original composition, though substantial portions remain lost. Additional fragments from other Nippur tablets and parallel text from Ur enable reconstruction of the general narrative structure and many specific details of Enki's organizational activities. The composition begins with an extended praise section, establishing Enki's authority and wisdom, before proceeding to describe his systematic organization of the world's fundamental structures. The text states that Enki placed in order the divine powers that govern the universe and made perfect the divine ordinances. This emphasis on ordering and perfecting suggests that Enki's work involved implementing a pre-existing plan rather than improvising solutions to emerging problems, consistent with the text's overall presentation of civilization as a designed system rather than a gradually evolved phenomenon. Enki's travels to different geographical regions receive detailed documentation in the poem, with specific attention to the establishment of administrative structures in each location. The text describes his journey to Sumer, where he blessed the land with agricultural abundance, to Ur, where he established the city's commercial prosperity, to Meluha, generally identified as the Indus Valley region, where he organized trade in precious stones and exotic materials, and to Dilmun, the Persian Gulf trading center, where he provided fresh water and agricultural capability. Each of these regional visits involves specific technological interventions that enable the local population to develop specialized economic activities contributing to the overall system. The agricultural organization described in the text includes detailed attention to irrigation engineering, crop selection, and land management that enabled Sumerian civilization to support large urban populations in an arid environment. The composition describes how Enki directed the marshes and positioned the carp and sustained the eels in the canebrake, demonstrating concern for ecosystem management alongside agricultural productivity. The text's attention to fish populations and wetland ecology reveals sophisticated understanding of the interconnected natural systems that sustained Mesopotamian food production. The appointment of divine overseers for specific economic activities creates a hierarchical administrative structure that mirrors the bureaucratic organization found in Sumerian temple and palace archives. The text describes how Enki placed the god Enlil in charge of heaven and earth, assigned Nana to govern the moon and regulate the calendar, appointed Utu to oversee justice and maintain social order, and designated numerous other divine administrators for specialized domains, including irrigation, metallurgy, textile production, and animal husbandry. This systematic delegation of responsibilities creates an organizational chart for managing all aspects of civilization. The precision and comprehensiveness of the administrative system described in Enki and the world order exceeds what would be expected in a purely mythological narrative. The text demonstrates detailed knowledge of the technological requirements for each specialized economic activity, the geographical distribution of natural resources necessary for different industries, and the coordination mechanisms needed to integrate specialized production into a functioning economic system. This level of administrative sophistication appearing in literature claiming to describe the initial organization of civilization suggests that Sumerian culture inherited, rather than independently developed, its complex economic and political structures. The instructions of Shuruppak represents one of the oldest examples of wisdom literature in human history. Attributed to Shuruppak, the last antediluvian king according to the Sumerian King List and father of the flood hero Ziusudra, the text, preserved on tablets from Abu Salabih, dating to approximately 2600 BC, presents itself as the transmission of essential knowledge from the pre-Diluvian world to post-flood humanity. Unlike typical wisdom collections that gradually accumulated over generations, this text appears fully formed with sophisticated ethical principles, practical guidance, and technical knowledge that suggests preservation of an established civilization's accumulated wisdom rather than the early development of human philosophy. The tablets containing the instructions of Shuruppak were excavated from Abu Salabih, ancient name unknown, during expeditions conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago and the British School of Archaeology in Iraq between 1963 and 1975. The site yielded over 500 tablets from the early dynastic period around 2600 BC, making them among the oldest literary texts ever discovered. The instructions appear on multiple tablets, indicating the text was copied and studied extensively even in this early period, suggesting it held authoritative status as a repository of essential knowledge. The framing narrative of the instructions establishes the text's purpose as intergenerational knowledge transmission from the antediluvian world. The composition begins with Shuruppak addressing his son Ziusudra, stating that he offers him instructions and that he would give him advice. This father-to-son teaching framework appears throughout ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, but the instructions of Shuruppak claims unusual historical depth by identifying the teacher as the final ruler before the flood and the student as the flood survivor who would preserve antediluvian knowledge for post-diluvian humanity. The content of the instructions encompasses far more than simple moral platitudes or practical life advice. The text includes sophisticated principles of governance, economic management, agricultural technique, and social organization that demonstrate comprehensive understanding of civilizational mechanics. Early precepts address interpersonal relationships and ethical conduct, instructing Ziusudra not to speak lies, not to kill, and not to steal, establishing fundamental moral principles. However, the text quickly moves beyond basic ethics to address complex administrative and technical matters. Agricultural instructions within the text demonstrate advanced understanding of farming science and land management. The composition advises careful attention to field preparation, proper timing of planting according to seasonal indicators, and systematic maintenance of irrigation infrastructure. One passage instructs that you should not dig a well in your field because people will cause damage on it, revealing awareness of property rights, water management complexities, and the social conflicts arising from shared resources. This level of administrative sophistication regarding agricultural infrastructure suggests the text preserves knowledge from an established civilization with centuries of farming experience. Economic guidance in the instructions addresses lending practices, property management, and commercial relationships with precision that indicates familiarity with complex market economies. The text warns against providing loans without adequate security, advises careful documentation of business transactions, and recommends diversification of economic activities to reduce vulnerability to crop failures or market disruptions. One particularly revealing passage states that you should not buy a donkey which brays because it will give away your possessions, demonstrating concern for operational security and commercial transport that would only develop in societies with established trade networks and property crime problems. The social and political advice contained in the instructions reveals sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, institutional authority, and governance structures. The text counsels careful navigation of relationships with powerful individuals, recommends against challenging established authority directly, and advises building networks of allies who can provide support during conflicts. Instructions regarding proper conduct in the royal palace, appropriate behavior when addressing assemblies, and techniques for managing subordinates all presuppose institutional complexity that required generations to develop. What distinguishes the instructions of Shurupak from later wisdom collections is its presentation as complete knowledge being preserved rather than developing wisdom gradually accumulating. The text does not describe how these principles were discovered or developed through experience, but presents them as established truths being transmitted to ensure their survival. This preservation emphasis aligns with the narrative framework identifying the text as antediluvian knowledge being saved from destruction through deliberate transmission to the flood survivor who would carry it into the post-diluvian world. Linguistic analysis of the instructions reveals archaic Sumerian grammatical forms and vocabulary that predate the early dynastic period when the surviving tablets were written. Specialists in Sumerian language development, including Miguel Civil and Joachim Krecher, have identified linguistic features in the instructions that appear nowhere else in the early dynastic corpus, but show similarities to the even earlier Uruk IV-period texts from around 3200 BC. This linguistic evidence supports the text's claim to preserve very ancient material that was already old when copied onto the Abu Salabic tablets around 2600 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh, while later in its most complete form, preserves much earlier Sumerian traditions about the antediluvian period and humanity's relationship with divine beings. The 11th tablet of the epic, discovered in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, contains the flood narrative told by Utnapishtim, who describes receiving direct warnings and technological instructions from the god Enki about an impending catastrophe designed to eliminate human civilization. The level of technical detail provided in Utnapishtim's account of vessel construction, including precise measurements, material specifications, and loading procedures, suggests the preservation of actual engineering knowledge rather than purely literary invention. The standard Akkadian version of the Gilgamesh epic, preserved on 12 tablets from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, represents the culmination of a literary tradition extending back over 1,000 years to Old Babylonian and earlier Sumerian sources. The epic's 11th tablet, containing the flood narrative, was among the first cuneiform texts translated in modern times, with George Smith of the British Museum announcing his decipherment in 1872 to tremendous public interest. The discovery that Mesopotamian literature contained a flood account predating the biblical narrative by over a millennium revolutionized understanding of ancient Near Eastern cultural relationships. The flood narrative within Gilgamesh begins when the hero, having failed to obtain immortality through other means, seeks out Utnapishtim, the only human granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim's account of how he achieved this status provides detailed testimony about the flood catastrophe and the technological preparations that enabled his survival. The narrative framework presents this as eyewitness testimony rather than mythological speculation, with Utnapishtim describing specific decisions, conversations, and technical procedures he personally experienced. Utnapishtim's account begins with the god Enki warning him of the coming flood by speaking through the reed wall of his house, a communication method that allowed Enki to circumvent the oath of secrecy imposed by the Divine Council regarding the planned destruction of humanity. The text preserves Enki's specific warning that the gods have decided to send a deluge, and that Utnapishtim must tear down his house and build a boat. This instruction to demolish his existing dwelling to provide materials for the vessel demonstrates practical resource management rather than miraculous provision. The technical specifications for the survival vessel receive extraordinary attention in the text. Utnapishtim describes the boat as having equal dimensions in length, width, and height, each measuring 120 cubits, creating a cube-shaped vessel approximately 60 meters on each side. The structure incorporated 6 decks, dividing the interior into 7 levels, with the hull divided into 9 compartments to provide structural integrity and damage control capability. The use of compartmentalization in ancient ship design demonstrates sophisticated understanding of naval architecture principles that would later be recognized as essential for seaworthy vessels. The construction materials and waterproofing procedures receive detailed specification in the narrative. Utnapishtim describes using 3,600 talents of bitumen for coating the exterior and 3,600 talents of pitch for waterproofing the interior, quantities that demonstrate the massive scale of the construction project. The text specifies that he poured 3 shar of oil into the kiln, using the Sumerian measurement term shar equal to 3,600, indicating that enormous quantities of oil were required for processing the waterproofing materials. This level of technical detail regarding materials quantities and processing requirements suggests preservation of actual engineering documentation. The loading procedures for the vessel demonstrate systematic planning for long-term survival, with diverse biological cargo. Utnapishtim describes bringing aboard all his silver and gold, all living creatures both wild and domestic, craftsmen of every skill, and his entire family. The inclusion of skilled craftsmen alongside the biological specimens reveals understanding that preserving civilization required preserving technical knowledge and capabilities, not merely genetic diversity. The text specifies that he brought aboard examples of all living things, indicating a comprehensive biological preservation program, rather than random selection. The duration and intensity of the flood receive precise documentation in Utnapishtim's account. The text states that for 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew, the downpour, the tempest, and the flood overwhelmed the land. This specific duration differs from the 40 days and 40 nights of the biblical flood narrative, suggesting independent preservation of flood traditions rather than later borrowing between cultures. The description of the flood's intensity includes poetic but also technically informative details, stating that the gods cowered like dogs and crouched by the outer wall, indicating that even divine beings found the catastrophe overwhelming. The aftermath of the flood includes Utnapishtim's vessel coming to rest on Mount Nimush, identified by most scholars as a peak in the Zagros Mountains northeast of Mesopotamia. The text describes Utnapishtim conducting systematic tests to determine when conditions had become safe for disembarkation, sending out a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven to assess environmental recovery. This experimental approach to evaluating post-catastrophe conditions demonstrates scientific methodology, rather than simply waiting for divine instruction. The Sumerian poem describing Inanna's descent to the underworld, preserved on tablets from Nippur dating to approximately 1900 BC, contains encoded references to advanced knowledge systems and technological capabilities attributed to divine beings. The text describes Inanna acquiring what it terms the me, divine decrees, or fundamental principles that govern all aspects of civilization, from kingship and priesthood to craftsmanship and warfare. The precision with which these me are catalogued and the systematic organization of civilizational elements they represent suggest documentation of an actual knowledge transfer system rather than abstract religious concepts. The composition known as Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld exists in multiple fragmentary copies from Nippur, with additional versions from Ur providing parallel text that enables reconstruction of most of the original narrative. The poem belongs to a cycle of Inanna literature that includes several compositions describing the goddess, acquiring and wielding various forms of power and knowledge. The descent narrative specifically focuses on Inanna's journey to the underworld realm governed by her sister Ereshkigal, a journey that requires passing through 7 gates and surrendering aspects of her divine power at each threshold. The me that Inanna possesses before her descent represent fundamental principles or powers that enable civilizational functions. Other texts, particularly the composition known as Inanna and Enki, provide detailed catalogues of these me, listing over 100 specific items that encompass all aspects of organized society. The me include abstract concepts like kingship, priesthood, and truth, but also concrete technologies like metalworking, leatherworking, and woodworking, suggesting they represent both knowledge systems and practical capabilities rather than purely spiritual principles. The systematic organization of the me into categories covering all civilizational domains demonstrates comprehensive understanding of the interconnected elements necessary for functioning urban society. The lists include political structures such as kingship, governance, and the giving of judgments, religious institutions including the high priesthood, temple organization, and ritual procedures, military capabilities such as weapons, warfare, and the destruction of cities, economic activities including shepherding, prostitution, and musical performance, and fundamental technologies encompassing writing, mathematics, and various crafts. The presentation of these me as discrete transferable items, rather than gradually developed cultural practices, suggests they were understood as modular knowledge units that could be acquired, transferred, or lost as complete packages. The narrative describes Inanna receiving the me from Enki, who held them in his possession and controlled their distribution. This centralized control over fundamental civilizational knowledge implies an administrative system for managing technological and cultural transfer rather than organic development of human capabilities through experimentation and innovation. The journey through the 7 gates of the underworld forces Inanna to surrender portions of her divine regalia and power at each threshold, creating a systematic stripping away of capabilities as she descends deeper into the netherworld. At the first gate she surrenders her crown, at the second her earrings, at the third her necklace of lapis lazuli, continuing through the removal of her royal robe, her breastplate, her rings, and finally her queenly garment. This progressive loss of power-bearing items suggests that divine capabilities were understood to reside in or be mediated through physical objects, rather than being purely intrinsic spiritual qualities. The death and resurrection of Inanna forms the climax of the narrative, with the goddess reduced to a corpse hung on a hook in the underworld, before being restored to life through intervention by Enki. The mechanism of resurrection involves Enki creating special beings called Galatura and Kurjara, who carry food of life and water of life to sprinkle on Inanna's corpse. The specification of particular substances capable of restoring life to the dead suggests these were understood as actual materials with biological properties rather than symbolic magical elements. The retrieval of the me from the underworld and their restoration to Inanna involves complex negotiations and the provision of a substitute to remain in the netherworld in Inanna's place. The text emphasizes that divine power and knowledge cannot simply be claimed but must be properly transferred through established protocols, with appropriate exchanges maintaining cosmic balance. This legalistic approach to knowledge and power transfer reflects bureaucratic understanding of administrative procedures rather than the arbitrary exercise of divine will. The cultural importance of the Inanna's descent narrative in Sumerian civilization is evidenced by its frequent copying, its incorporation into ritual practices, and its influence on later Mesopotamian literature, including the Akkadian descent of Ishtar. The story was not merely entertainment, but served educational functions, preserving information about the systematic organization of civilizational knowledge and the proper procedures for its transmission and preservation. The Barton cylinder, discovered at Tello and dating to approximately 2100 BC, preserves detailed accounts of temple construction under direct divine supervision. The text describes how the god Ningirsu provided specific architectural plans, precise measurements, and construction techniques to the human ruler Gudea for building the Ininu temple. The level of technical specification in these divine instructions, including materials science, astronomical alignments, and engineering calculations, exceeds what should have been available to early Bronze Age civilizations through conventional developmental pathways. The Barton cylinder takes its name from George Aaron Barton, who acquired the artifact for the University of Pennsylvania Museum in the early 20th century. The cylinder, along with a companion piece known as Cylinder B, preserves the most extensive building inscription from ancient Mesopotamia, totaling over 1,300 lines of Sumerian poetry describing Gudea's temple construction project. The text was composed during the reign of Gudea himself around 2100 BC, making it contemporary with the events it describes, rather than a later legendary elaboration. The narrative begins with Gudea receiving the commission to build the Aninu temple through a series of dreams in which the god Ningirsu appears with detailed instructions. The first dream presents Ningirsu showing Gudea a plan of the temple, described as being drawn on a lapis lazuli tablet. The use of lapis lazuli, a precious blue stone imported from Afghanistan, as the medium for architectural plans suggests that these were valuable documents intended for permanent preservation, rather than temporary working drawings. The divine architectural plans included precise measurements for every aspect of the temple complex. The text describes specific dimensions for the foundation platform, the height and thickness of walls, the spacing of columns, and the proportions of ceremonial chambers. Gudea describes how he established a brick mould of 1 sa in size, using the Sumerian measurement equal to approximately 36 square meters, ensuring standardization of building materials throughout the construction project. This attention to standardized components demonstrates understanding of modular construction principles that facilitate assembly and ensure structural consistency. The material specifications provided by Ningirsu required Gudea to obtain resources from distant locations across the ancient Near East. The text describes expeditions to the cedar forests of Lebanon, the diorite quarries of Magan in Oman, the gold sources of Havilah, and the copper mines of the Zagros Mountains. The ability to coordinate resource extraction and transportation across such vast distances indicates sophisticated logistics capabilities and established trade networks extending throughout the region. The astronomical alignments incorporated into the temple design receive explicit mention in the text. Gudea describes orienting the temple structure according to celestial observations, ensuring that specific chambers aligned with the rising and setting positions of important stars and planets at particular times of year. The precision required for these astronomical alignments necessitated detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics and accurate observational instruments for measuring stellar positions. The construction workforce organization described in the Barton cylinder reveals systematic project management and labor coordination. Gudea assembled workers from throughout his territory, organizing them into specialized teams responsible for different construction tasks. The text describes teams of brickmakers, stone cutters, carpenters, metal workers, and other specialists, each working under supervisors who reported to master craftsmen overseeing the entire project. This hierarchical organization and functional specialization demonstrates administrative sophistication comparable to modern large-scale construction projects. The completion ceremony for the Aninu temple involved elaborate rituals designed to activate the structure's sacred functions and establish communication links with the divine realm. The text describes the installation of specific objects in designated locations throughout the temple, the performance of purification ceremonies, and the formal invitation to Ningirsu to take up residence in the completed structure. These activation procedures suggest the temple was understood as functional technology requiring proper initialization rather than merely symbolic religious architecture. The Enuma Elish, while composed during the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, preserves much earlier Sumerian creation traditions in Akkadian form. This epic describes not just spiritual creation, but cosmic engineering, detailing how the god Marduk restructured the physical universe after defeating Tiamat in celestial warfare. The text includes references to astronomical phenomena, planetary mechanics, and cosmic organization that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial dynamics beyond what conventional archaeology attributes to ancient Mesopotamian culture. The Enuma Elish survives in multiple copies from various Mesopotamian sites, with the most complete version coming from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. The epic consists of 7 tablets totaling approximately 1,000 lines of Akkadian poetry, though portions remain fragmentary or lost. The composition served important ritual functions in Babylonian religion, being recited annually during the New Year festival, when cosmic order was symbolically renewed and royal authority religiously legitimated. The opening of the epic describes primordial conditions before the organization of the cosmos, stating that when the heavens above were not named and the earth below had not been called by name, only the primordial waters of Apsu and Tiamat existed. This emphasis on naming as the act that brings ordered reality into existence reflects Mesopotamian understanding that classification and systematic organization represent the fundamental processes by which chaos becomes cosmos. The conflict between older and younger generations of gods drives the narrative toward its climactic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. The epic describes how the older gods, disturbed by the noise and activity of their younger offspring, plan to destroy them to restore primordial quiet. This intergenerational divine conflict parallels the Atrahasis narrative's description of gods being disturbed by human noise, suggesting that Mesopotamian cosmological thought recognized population pressure and resource competition as fundamental drivers of cosmic change. Marduk's preparation for battle with Tiamat includes the acquisition or creation of sophisticated weapons and equipment, described in terms suggesting advanced technology. The text describes Marduk creating the four winds to stir up Tiamat's interior, fashioning lightning as his weapon, making a net to encircle Tiamat, and creating the Mhulu wind that would fill her mouth. These combat preparations demonstrate systematic planning and equipment development, rather than reliance on intrinsic divine power alone. The battle itself is described with attention to tactical details and combat dynamics. Marduk captures Tiamat in his net, fills her with the Mhulu wind, causing her to distend, then shoots an arrow that splits her heart and pierces her belly. The clinical precision of this combat description, specifying the sequence of tactical moves and their specific effects, reads more like military after-action reporting than mythological poetry. The cosmic restructuring following Marduk's victory receives extensive documentation, demonstrating detailed astronomical and cosmological knowledge. The text describes Marduk splitting Tiamat's corpse like a shellfish into two parts, raising half to form the sky as a covering and setting the other half as the foundation for the earth. This division creates the fundamental structure of the Mesopotamian universe, with the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the underworld below. The establishment of celestial bodies and their movements receives systematic treatment revealing sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The text describes Marduk creating stations for the great gods, establishing the stars and constellations, designating the year and dividing it into months and setting the moon to mark time periods. The epic specifies that Marduk appointed 3 stars for each of the 12 months, creating the 36 decan stars that ancient Mesopotamian astronomers used for tracking the annual cycle. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish serves similar purposes as in earlier Sumerian accounts, providing workers to serve the gods and free divine beings from physical labor. The epic describes Marduk proposing human creation and implementing it through the sacrifice of Kingu, Tiamat's consort, whose blood provides the raw material for human manufacture. The text states that from his blood, humanity was created and the service of the gods was imposed, maintaining the utilitarian approach to human creation found throughout Mesopotamian creation literature. The Sumerian poem known as the Curse of Agade describes the catastrophic collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2100 BC, attributing the disaster to divine withdrawal and the breaking of established protocols between gods and humanity. The text provides detailed descriptions of economic breakdown, agricultural failure, and social disintegration that followed the cessation of divine guidance, suggesting that early Mesopotamian civilization depended on ongoing technological and administrative support from external sources rather than developing entirely through indigenous human innovation. The Curse of Agade survives in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, with the most complete version preserved on tablets, excavated from Nippur and currently housed in the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. The composition consists of approximately 280 lines of Sumerian poetry that describe the rise and catastrophic fall of Agade, the capital city of the Akkadian Empire established by Sargon around 2300 BC. The text was composed several centuries after the events it describes, during a period when the ruins of Agade served as a cautionary monument to civilizational hubris and divine displeasure. The narrative begins by describing Agade's golden age, when the city enjoyed unprecedented prosperity under divine patronage. The text states that Inanna had established her dwelling in Agade, and that the city therefore received abundant wealth from throughout the known world. Ships from Dilmun, Megan, and Meluha brought exotic goods to Agade's docks, while tribute arrived from conquered territories throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The poem describes warehouses overflowing with grain, streets filled with celebrating people, and temples receiving lavish offerings, painting a picture of a civilization at the apex of its power and prosperity. The turning point in Agade's fortunes came when the city's ruler, Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, violated sacred protocols governing human-divine relationships. The text describes how Naram-Sin grew arrogant in his power and committed sacrilege against the Ikur temple at Nippur, the religious center of Sumerian civilization and earthly seat of the god Enlil. The specific nature of Naram-Sin's offense involved his unauthorized entry into restricted temple areas and his seizure of sacred objects that were forbidden to human contact. The divine response to this sacrilege involved the systematic withdrawal of divine support that had previously sustained Agade's prosperity. The poem describes how Enlil pronounced a curse upon the city and how the other gods abandoned their temples in Agade, taking with them the divine powers and blessings that had enabled the city's success. The text emphasizes that this divine withdrawal was not arbitrary punishment, but the natural consequence of breaking established covenant relationships that governed interactions between divine and human spheres. The economic collapse that followed divine withdrawal receives detailed documentation in the poem. The text describes how trade networks suddenly ceased functioning, with ships no longer arriving from foreign ports and caravans refusing to travel to Agade. Agricultural productivity declined dramatically, with fields producing only weeds instead of grain, and irrigation systems failing despite continued human maintenance efforts. The poem specifies that the waterways brought nothing but hunger, and that the orchards and gardens bore no fruit, indicating comprehensive environmental and economic breakdown. Social disintegration accompanied economic collapse, with the text describing the breakdown of law, the rise of violence, and the fragmentation of community bonds that had held Agade's population together during prosperous times. The poem states that brother consumed brother in Agade, and that friend struck down friend with weapons, indicating that civilized social norms collapsed when divine oversight and material abundance disappeared. Families abandoned the city seeking survival elsewhere, leaving buildings to decay and streets to fill with debris. The physical destruction of Agade came not through military conquest, but through environmental catastrophe that the text attributes to divine agency. The poem describes how Enlil summoned the Gutian people from the mountains to complete the city's destruction, but emphasizes that Agade was already dying from the withdrawal of divine support before foreign armies arrived. The text states that these mountain warriors descended like locusts, filled the land like the onset of locusts, and nothing escaped their arms, portraying them as instruments of divine will rather than independent military force. The curse pronounced upon Agade's ruins ensured that the city would never be rebuilt or re-inhabited. The poem describes specific prohibitions preventing future generations from resettling the site, with Enlil decreeing that the city would remain desolate as a warning to later rulers who might be tempted to violate divine protocols. Archaeological surveys of the region where Agade presumably stood have indeed failed to identify any major settlement matching the city's description, with the site remaining lost to modern archaeology despite extensive searching. The implications of the Curse of Agade for understanding Mesopotamian civilization extend beyond the specific historical events it describes. The text presents civilizational success as dependent on maintaining proper relationships with divine administrators who provided essential support for economic, agricultural, and social systems. The rapid and complete collapse following divine withdrawal suggests that human populations lacked the independent capability to maintain complex urban civilization without ongoing external assistance. The Epic of Lugalbanda, preserved on tablets from the 3 period around 2100 BC, contains descriptions of divine artifacts and technological capabilities that appear anachronistic for Bronze Age literature. The text describes Lugalbanda encountering divine beings in remote mountain locations where they maintain equipment and facilities that enable communication across vast distances and provide protection through means that exceed normal ancient military technology. These descriptions, embedded within adventure narrative, may preserve memories of actual technological installations maintained by advanced beings. The Lugalbanda epic cycle consists of two major compositions, Lugalbanda in the Mountain Cave and Lugalbanda and the Unzud Bird, totaling over 800 lines of Sumerian poetry. The narratives describe the adventures of Lugalbanda, identified in the Sumerian King List as an early ruler of Uruk and father of the legendary Gilgamesh. The texts survive in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, though they clearly preserve much earlier oral traditions about this antediluvian or early post-diluvian figure. The first composition describes Lugalbanda becoming separated from an army expedition travelling through remote mountain regions and taking shelter in a cave while recovering from illness. The location is specified as being in the mountains of Huram, generally identified as the Zagros Range northeast of Mesopotamia. The isolation of this setting, far from human settlements, creates the narrative context for Lugalbanda's encounter with divine beings operating outside normal civilizational boundaries. During his isolation, Lugalbanda performs religious ceremonies that attract the attention of the sky deities Utu and Inanna. The text describes these divine beings appearing to Lugalbanda not in temples or urban settings, but in the remote mountain wilderness, suggesting they maintained presence in locations removed from human populations. The poem emphasizes that Lugalbanda gained favor with these deities through proper ritual procedures, indicating that access to divine assistance required knowledge of specific protocols rather than being freely available. The divine gifts bestowed upon Lugalbanda include capabilities that appear technological rather than purely supernatural. The text describes him receiving the ability to run with extraordinary speed, covering vast distances without fatigue, suggesting enhancement of physical capabilities through means beyond normal human potential. The poem states that Lugalbanda could run like a donkey in the desert, could gallop like a horse in the steppe, and could cover distances that normally required days of travel in mere hours. The mechanism by which Lugalbanda acquired these enhanced capabilities receives specific attention in the text. The poem describes Inanna anointing him with special substances and performing procedures that transformed his physical nature. The text mentions the application of specific unguents, the performance of particular gestures, and the recitation of empowering incantations, suggesting a systematic enhancement process rather than spontaneous miraculous transformation. The second Lugalbanda composition describes his encounter with the Unzud Bird, a divine creature dwelling in remote mountains and possessing extraordinary powers. The text portrays Unzud not as a simple mythological monster, but as a being maintaining a sophisticated mountain installation with specific territorial boundaries and defensive capabilities. Lugalbanda approaches Unzud's dwelling with appropriate offerings and requests assistance, receiving in return divine favor that enables him to complete his mission. The description of Unzud's mountain habitat includes details suggesting a permanent installation rather than a simple nest. The text mentions architectural features, stored provisions, and protected spaces that indicate deliberate construction and ongoing maintenance. The poem describes Lugalbanda ascending to Unzud's dwelling place and finding it equipped with specific amenities that enabled comfortable habitation in the harsh mountain environment. The gifts Lugalbanda receives from Unzud provide additional technological capabilities beyond those granted by Inanna. The text describes Unzud bestowing knowledge of secret paths through mountain ranges, understanding of weather patterns that would affect travel, and protection against hostile forces that might threaten his journey. These capabilities suggest access to information networks and defensive systems that exceeded normal human capacities. The military applications of Lugalbanda's divinely enhanced capabilities receive extensive treatment when he rejoins his army and uses his abilities to resolve the military crisis facing the expedition. The text describes him travelling overnight across distances that had required the army weeks to traverse, delivering crucial intelligence to commanders and enabling strategic decisions that ensured victory. The poem emphasizes that Lugalbanda's enhanced speed and endurance provided decisive military advantage, suggesting that divine technological assistance could determine outcomes of human conflicts. The permanent nature of Lugalbanda's enhancements indicates they involved fundamental modification of his capabilities rather than temporary supernatural intervention. The text describes him retaining his extraordinary abilities throughout his life, eventually passing enhanced traits to his son Gilgamesh, who inherited superhuman strength and longevity. This hereditary transmission of enhanced capabilities suggests biological modification that affected genetic inheritance rather than purely external technological augmentation. The Sumerian poem describing the marriage of the god Martu contains references to the creation of hybrid beings through the union of divine and human bloodlines. The text, dating to approximately 1900 BC, describes systematic programs for maintaining specific genetic characteristics within royal and priestly families, suggesting that Sumerian civilization recognized and actively managed the biological legacy of divine-human interaction. Administrative tablets from the same period contain genealogical records traced with unprecedented precision, consistent with systematic breeding programs designed to preserve desired traits. The marriage of Martu survives in multiple Old Babylonian copies from Nippur and other sites, preserving a narrative that addresses the controversial topic of divine-human sexual relationships and their biological consequences. The composition describes how the god Martu, associated with the western desert regions and nomadic populations, sought to marry a human woman from the city of Ninab despite the cultural differences between settled agricultural populations and pastoral nomads. The narrative framework establishes the marriage as requiring formal negotiations and approval from divine authorities rather than being a simple personal relationship. The text describes Martu's request to marry the daughter of the city god Nemushta, who initially objects to the union on grounds of cultural incompatibility. The poem presents detailed arguments from both sides regarding the suitability of cross-cultural marriage, revealing sophisticated understanding of the social, economic, and biological factors affecting marriage alliances. The divine human nature of the proposed union receives explicit acknowledgement in the text, with various speakers addressing the implications of mixing divine and mortal bloodlines. The bride's mother raises concerns about whether her daughter could survive intimacy with a divine being, and whether any offspring would be viable. These practical biological concerns suggest the text addresses actual physical compatibility issues rather than purely symbolic spiritual marriage. The resolution of these concerns involves Martu demonstrating his suitability as a husband through accomplishing specific tasks that prove his capability to provide for a family according to human cultural norms. The text describes him engaging in agricultural work, participating in urban economic activities, and demonstrating knowledge of civilized customs, showing that he could function within human society despite his divine nature. This emphasis on practical compatibility over purely spiritual considerations reinforces the interpretation that the text addresses actual biological and social integration challenges. The offspring resulting from divine-human unions receive attention in related Sumerian texts that describe hybrid beings possessing characteristics of both ancestral lines. Administrative documents from the Ur-III period contain genealogical records that track royal bloodlines with extraordinary precision, noting specific physical characteristics, capabilities, and distinguishing features across multiple generations. These genealogical tablets use terminology that distinguishes pure human lineages from those claiming divine ancestry, suggesting systematic monitoring of bloodline purity. The royal cemetery at Ur provides archaeological evidence consistent with special treatment of individuals from divinely descended bloodlines. Excavations conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 uncovered burial practices that distinguish certain individuals through unique preservation procedures, elaborate grave goods, and tomb construction techniques exceeding normal elite burials. Analysis of skeletal remains from these special burials has revealed unusual physical characteristics, including increased cranial capacity, distinctive bone density, and dental patterns differing from contemporary populations. The genetic management programs implied by genealogical tablets involve strategic marriage alliances designed to concentrate or dilute divine bloodline characteristics according to specific goals. Texts describe calculations of bloodline percentages, predictions of offspring characteristics based on parental lineages, and recommendations for optimal marriage pairings to achieve desired traits in subsequent generations. This systematic approach to heredity management demonstrates understanding of genetic inheritance principles millennia before their formal scientific recognition. The social privileges and responsibilities associated with divine ancestry receive extensive documentation in Sumerian legal and administrative texts. Individuals from documented divine bloodlines held specific temple positions, performed particular ritual functions, and enjoyed legal status distinguishing them from common citizens. These privileges came with obligations to maintain bloodline purity through approved marriages, to produce heirs capable of continuing family traditions, and to preserve specialized knowledge passed down through family lines. The decline of active divine human reproduction following the flood, according to Mesopotamian tradition, created the challenge of preserving existing hybrid bloodlines without fresh infusion of divine genetic material. Later texts describe increasingly restrictive marriage practices designed to maintain bloodline characteristics within shrinking pools of eligible partners, eventually leading to the elaborate royal marriage alliances that characterized later Mesopotamian dynasties. The composition describing the moon god Nanna-Suen's journey to Nippur to receive approval for his city provides detailed documentation of the administrative hierarchy governing Mesopotamian civilization. The text, preserved on tablets from approximately 2100 BC, describes formal bureaucratic procedures, territorial jurisdictions, and communication protocols that governed interactions between different divine administrators and their human representatives. The sophistication of this administrative system, appearing fully formed in the earliest written records, suggests inheritance of established governmental structures rather than gradual institutional development. The text known as Nanna-Suen's Journey to Nippur survives in multiple copies from the Ur III period, a time when Ur served as capital of a reunified Sumerian state under the third dynasty of Ur. The composition describes Nanna-Suen, patron deity of Ur, undertaking a ceremonial journey to Nippur to receive formal recognition and blessing from Enlil, the senior divine administrator whose temple at Nippur served as the religious and administrative center of Sumerian civilization. The preparation for this journey receives detailed documentation, revealing complex logistics and protocol requirements. The text describes the loading of boats with tribute goods, including precious metals, exotic stones, fine textiles, and specialty foods representing Ur's economic productivity and commercial connections. The quantities and varieties of goods are specified with precision typical of administrative inventories, suggesting the composition preserves actual records of tribute deliveries rather than invented literary details. The route of the journey follows the Euphrates River northward from Ur to Nippur, with the text naming specific cities and landmarks along the way. Each stop involves formal ceremonies where local divine administrators pay respects to Nanna-Suen and add their own tribute goods to the cargo. This ceremonial progress demonstrates the hierarchical relationships between different divine territorial governors and establishes the protocol for communication between administrative centers. The arrival at Nippur triggers elaborate reception ceremonies involving multiple levels of divine bureaucracy. The text describes how Nanna-Suen first presents himself to Enlil's vizier Nusku, who evaluates the tribute goods and determines whether they meet standards for formal presentation to Enlil. This bureaucratic screening process mirrors administrative procedures documented in secular palace archives, where petitioners needed approval from subordinate officials before gaining audience with the king. The formal audience with Enlil involves presentation of tribute, recitation of Ur's accomplishments, and request for continued divine support and recognition. The text preserves the specific language used in these formal communications, including honorific titles, formulaic greetings, and technical terminology for different administrative functions. The precision of this diplomatic language suggests preservation of actual protocol documents used in regular communications between administrative centers. Enlil's response to Nanna-Suen's petition involves formal decree pronouncing blessing upon Ur and confirming its status within the administrative hierarchy. The text describes Enlil issuing specific guarantees regarding agricultural productivity, commercial prosperity, and military security that would enable Ur to maintain its position as a major urban center. These guarantees are presented not as vague religious blessings, but as concrete administrative commitments, requiring ongoing divine support and oversight. The return journey to Ur involves distribution of Enlil's blessings to the cities along the route, establishing a network of mutual obligations and shared prosperity. The text describes how each city receives specific benefits appropriate to its resources and economic specialization, creating an integrated economic system coordinated through the divine administrative hierarchy. This systematic approach to regional economic development demonstrates comprehensive planning and resource management capabilities. The annual repetition of this journey, according to the text, maintained the relationship between Ea and Nippur and ensured continued divine support for the political and economic system. The composition describes this as an established ritual rather than a one-time event, indicating that regular communication and tribute delivery sustained the administrative network governing Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerian disputation texts, including debates between grain and sheep. Summer and winter and other personified natural forces preserve information about the organized development of agriculture, animal husbandry, and economic specialization in early Mesopotamia. These texts, dating to the Earth III period, describe the systematic introduction of different crops, livestock breeds, and economic activities as deliberate programs rather than gradual human innovation, consistent with accounts of divine instruction in fundamental civilizational technologies. The disputation genre represents a distinctive category of Sumerian literature in which two entities, often personified natural or cultural elements, engage in formalized debate about their relative importance to civilization. These compositions follow standardized structures including self-praise sections, mutual criticism, and final divine judgment determining the winner. The literary sophistication of these debates has led scholars to focus on their rhetorical and poetic qualities, while sometimes overlooking the technical information they preserve about economic development. The debate between grain and sheep, preserved on tablets from Nippur dating to approximately 1900 BC, provides detailed accounts of cereal agriculture and animal husbandry techniques. The text describes grain boasting about the cultivation procedures, irrigation requirements, and processing methods necessary to transform raw crops into usable food supplies. Sheep responds with descriptions of wool production, meat provision, and dairy processing that support human civilization. The technical precision of these descriptions exceeds what would be expected in purely literary composition. Grain's self-presentation includes specific information about field preparation, planting procedures, irrigation management, and harvest techniques. The text describes the use of specific tools including plows, harrows, and sickles, detailing their construction and proper employment. References to seed selection, planting density, and fertilization methods demonstrate sophisticated agricultural science. The description of irrigation includes technical details about canal construction, water distribution, and drainage management that required engineering expertise. Sheep's counterarguments focus on the diverse products derived from animal husbandry and their essential roles in human civilization. The text describes wool production, including shearing procedures, fiber preparation, and textile manufacturing. Meat provision receives attention through descriptions of butchering procedures and preservation methods. Dairy processing is detailed through accounts of milk collection, cheese making, and butter production. These descriptions demonstrate comprehensive understanding of animal husbandry, representing generations of accumulated knowledge. The debate between summer and winter addresses seasonal agricultural cycles and the complementary economic activities appropriate to different times of year. Summer describes the intensive agricultural work of planting, cultivation, and harvest that occurs during warm months. Winter presents the planning, preparation, and processing activities that occupy the cold season when fieldwork becomes impossible. The text reveals understanding of agricultural planning requiring year-round coordination of different activities. The technical details preserved in these debates include information about crop varieties, livestock breeds, and specialized techniques that would have required deliberate development programs. References to specific barley and wheat varieties suited to different soil conditions and irrigation regimes demonstrate genetic selection and breeding programs. Descriptions of sheep breeds optimized for wool production versus meat provision indicate systematic animal breeding. The sophistication of these agricultural and husbandry techniques appearing in early texts suggests inheritance of established knowledge rather than recent innovation. The resolution of these debates consistently involves divine judgment, determining that both parties contribute essential value to civilization and must work cooperatively. This emphasis on complementarity and integration reveals understanding that complex economies require multiple specialized activities coordinated through systematic planning. The texts present economic specialization not as naturally emerging but as divinely organized. consistent with other Sumerian narratives describing civilization as a designed system implemented through deliberate instruction. The Kesh Temple Hymn, one of the oldest literary compositions in Sumerian, describes temple construction as the establishment of communication links between earthly and celestial domains. The text, dating to approximately 2600 BC, provides technical specifications for temple orientation, astronomical alignments, and acoustic properties that enabled these structures to serve as technological interfaces rather than purely ceremonial spaces. Archaeological evidence from excavated temple sites confirms the precision of astronomical alignments and sophisticated acoustic engineering described in these ancient hymns. The Kesh Temple Hymn survives on tablets from Abu Salabik and other early dynastic sites, making it one of the oldest literary texts ever discovered. The composition consists of approximately 130 lines praising the Kesh Temple, dedicated to the goddess Nintud, though the city of Kesh itself has never been conclusively identified through archaeological excavation. The antiquity of this text and its sophisticated technical content suggest it preserves traditions from the very earliest phases of Sumerian urban civilization. The opening sections of the hymn describe the cosmic significance of temple construction, stating that when the temple was built, earth and heaven rejoiced together. This linking of terrestrial architecture with celestial response indicates that temples were understood as creating functional connections between different cosmic domains, rather than merely symbolizing such relationships. The text emphasizes that proper temple construction required precise adherence to divine specifications to ensure these connections functioned correctly. The architectural specifications preserved in the hymn include detailed attention to foundation orientation and structural alignment with celestial phenomena. The text describes the temple as being founded in a pure place and oriented toward the rising of specific stars and planets. These astronomical alignments were not decorative elements, but functional requirements enabling the temple to serve its purpose as a communication facility. The precision required for these alignments demanded sophisticated surveying techniques and astronomical knowledge. The acoustic properties of temple architecture receive extensive treatment in the Kesh Temple Hymn. The text describes how the temple's voice reaches heaven and how its sound is sweet to the gods. These references to temple acoustics suggest that the structures were designed to amplify, focus, or modify sounds in specific ways that facilitated communication with divine beings. The hymn mentions particular architectural features including specific chamber dimensions and surface treatments that would affect sound propagation and resonance. Archaeological investigation of early dynastic temple sites has confirmed the sophisticated acoustic engineering described in texts like the Kesh Temple Hymn. Excavations at Eridu, Uruk, and other major temple complexes have revealed architectural features specifically designed to create acoustic effects. Chambers with parabolic ceiling curves that focus sound at specific points, wall surfaces with carefully calculated angles that direct sound along particular paths, and resonance chambers that amplify certain frequencies while dampening others all demonstrate intentional acoustic design. The temple at Eridu, excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, contains acoustic features that create remarkable sound effects when tested by modern researchers. Standing at designated positions within certain chambers and speaking or singing at particular pitches produces amplification effects that make voices carry to distant parts of the temple complex. These effects result from precise geometric relationships between room dimensions, ceiling heights, and surface materials that could not have occurred accidentally. The materials specified in the Kesh Temple Hymn include substances chosen for their acoustic properties in addition to their structural or aesthetic qualities. The text mentions the use of specific types of wood for ceiling beams, particular stones for wall construction, and certain clays for floor surfaces. Modern acoustic analysis reveals that these material selections create optimal sound propagation characteristics, with different materials absorbing or reflecting specific frequency ranges. The ritual procedures described in the hymn involve sound generation at specific times when astronomical conditions align properly. The text describes ceremonies timed to coincide with the rising or setting of particular celestial bodies, suggesting that temple communication functions required both architectural alignment and temporal synchronization. The combination of spatial orientation, acoustic properties, and temporal coordination created a complete system for establishing contact with divine beings. The divine response to properly conducted temple ceremonies receives detailed description in the hymn. The text states that when the temple raises its head in the pure place, when Kesh raises its head in the pure place, Nintud comes forth from the holy dwelling. This language describes actual manifestation of divine presence rather than metaphorical spiritual communion, suggesting that correct execution of architectural and ceremonial requirements produced observable effects. The transmission of temple construction knowledge from divine instructors to human builders forms an important theme in the Kesh temple hymn. The text describes how the goddess Nintud provided specific instructions for temple construction, and how human craftsmen followed these divine specifications precisely. This emphasis on accurate transmission and faithful implementation of divine architectural plans indicates that temples were understood as requiring expert knowledge beyond human invention. The poem describing Dumuzid's prophetic dream contains references to knowledge of future events, and the ability of divine beings to perceive temporal sequences beyond normal human experience. This text, preserved on tablets from Nippur, describes communication methods and consciousness technologies that enabled access to information about events that had not yet occurred, suggesting that early Mesopotamian civilization possessed or was taught advanced mental disciplines and possibly technological aids for enhanced perception. The composition known as Dumuzid's Dream exists in multiple fragmentary copies from the Old Babylonian period, though the narrative content clearly derives from earlier Sumerian traditions. The text describes the shepherd god Dumuzid receiving a prophetic dream that reveals his impending death at the hands of demons sent to drag him to the underworld. The precision and accuracy of the dream's predictions, verified through the narrative's subsequent events, suggest the text explores actual precognitive capabilities rather than vague omens requiring interpretation. The dream sequence itself receives extensive documentation detailing the symbolic content and its literal translation into future events. Dumuzid dreams of specific images including his staff being removed, his cup falling from its peg, and his churn lying shattered, each symbol corresponding precisely to particular aspects of his coming fate. The text emphasizes that these dream symbols conveyed accurate information about events that had not yet physically occurred, indicating access to knowledge beyond normal temporal experience. The interpretation of Dumuzid's dream by his sister Geshtinana demonstrates sophisticated understanding of symbolic systems for encoding temporal information. The text describes Geshtinana systematically analyzing each dream element and extracting its predictive content through application of established interpretive principles. This systematic approach to dream analysis suggests the existence of formal training in consciousness technologies and symbolic interpretation methods transmitted through priestly or scholarly institutions. The attempted escape following the dream interpretation reveals that prophetic knowledge enabled potential alteration of predicted futures, rather than merely passive observation of inevitable events. Dumuzid's flight from his pursuers demonstrates that foreknowledge created opportunities for intervention, suggesting that temporal perception technologies were understood as providing actionable intelligence rather than fatalistic destiny. The text describes specific evasion strategies based on knowledge of when and where the demons would search for him. The role of divine beings in facilitating prophetic dreams receives explicit attention in related Mesopotamian texts. Dream incubation rituals described in temple archives involved specific procedures for inducing prophetic dreams, including ritual purification, consumption of particular substances, sleeping in designated sacred spaces, and performing prescribed prayers or invocations. These systematic procedures suggest that prophetic dreaming was understood as a learnable skill, requiring proper preparation and technique, rather than spontaneous supernatural gift. The technological aids for enhanced perception mentioned in various Mesopotamian texts include substances, devices, and ritual procedures that altered consciousness to enable access to normally imperceptible information. Temple inventories list materials used in dream incubation ceremonies, including specific plants with psychoactive properties, aromatic substances burned to produce trance states, and crystalline objects positioned near sleepers to facilitate enhanced perception. The systematic documentation of these materials and their prescribed uses indicates established protocols for inducing altered consciousness states. The architectural features of dream incubation chambers discovered at temple sites demonstrate intentional design for facilitating altered consciousness experiences. Excavations at Nippur and other major temple complexes have revealed small chambers with specific acoustic properties, limited light access, and distinctive geometric proportions that modern sleep research recognizes as conducive to vivid dreaming and enhanced recall. The positioning of these chambers within larger temple complexes indicates they served specialized functions distinct from normal sleeping quarters. The training programs for dream interpreters preserved in scribal school curricula demonstrate that prophetic dream analysis required extensive education in symbolic systems, astronomical knowledge, and psychological principles. Student exercises include practice in analyzing complex symbolic sequences, correlating dream content with astronomical configurations, and distinguishing genuine prophetic dreams from ordinary sleep experiences. The sophistication of this training indicates that dream interpretation was recognized as requiring expert knowledge rather than intuitive insight. The verification procedures for prophetic dreams described in temple administrative texts reveal systematic approaches to distinguishing accurate precognition from chance correspondence or self-fulfilling prophecy. These procedures include documentation of dream content before predicted events occur, independent witness verification, and statistical analysis of prediction accuracy rates across multiple dreamers. The methodical nature of these verification protocols demonstrates that Mesopotamian scholars approached prophetic phenomena with empirical rigor. The exaltation of Inanna, composed by the priestess Enheduanna around 2300 BC, describes formal ceremonies for transferring divine authority and technological capabilities between different administrators. The text provides detailed accounts of ritual procedures that involved actual transmission of knowledge, authority, and possibly physical artifacts that enabled the exercise of power over natural forces and human populations. The precision of these ceremonial descriptions suggests they documented actual administrative protocols rather than purely symbolic religious practices. The exaltation of Inanna represents the earliest authored literary work in human history, with Enheduanna identified by name as the composer. The text survives on numerous copies from the Old Babylonian period, indicating its continued importance centuries after composition. Enheduanna held the position of High Priestess of the Moon, god Nanna at Ur, appointed to this crucial religious and political office by her father Sargon of Akkad when he conquered Sumer and established the first multi-regional empire in Mesopotamia. The historical context of the composition involves political crisis and power transfer during the Akkadian conquest of Sumerian city-states. Enheduanna describes being expelled from her temple position by a rebel leader named Lugalan, who rejected Akkadian authority and attempted to restore independent Sumerian rule. The text documents her appeal to Inanna for restoration to office, describing the formal procedures required to transfer divine authority and the technological capabilities associated with high priestly office. The power transfer ceremonies described in the exaltation involve more than symbolic recognition of authority. The text details the transmission of physical objects that embodied or enabled the exercise of priestly functions. Enheduanna describes the me, fundamental powers governing civilizational functions, and specific temple implements required for performing rituals that maintained cosmic order and ensured agricultural fertility. The loss of these objects during her expulsion from office represented actual inability to perform essential functions rather than merely symbolic diminishment. The restoration procedures detailed in the text required Inanna's direct intervention to override the rebel leader's claims and re-establish Enheduanna's legitimate authority. The poem describes how Inanna turned everything that is evil into ashes and destroyed those who refused to recognize proper authority. This description of divine intervention, producing physical effects against rebel forces, suggests that the power transfer involved more than spiritual recognition, but included tangible capabilities that could be demonstrated and verified. The ritual procedures for proper power transfer, described in the exaltation, include specific sequential steps that must be followed in correct order to ensure valid transmission of authority. The text mentions purification ceremonies, oath-taking procedures, transfer of sacred regalia, and formal proclamations witnessed by assembled dignitaries. The precision with which these steps are documented suggests they represent established legal and administrative protocols rather than improvised ceremonial elements. The sacred regalia associated with high priestly office included items that enabled specific technological functions beyond their symbolic significance. Temple inventories describe elaborate headdresses containing crystalline components, ceremonial garments incorporating metallic elements, and implements made from materials with unusual properties. Archaeological discoveries of high-status burials have recovered examples of these objects, revealing sophisticated craftsmanship and material science, exceeding typical ancient capabilities. The training requirements for high priestly office described in administrative texts indicate that power transfer involved transmission of complex knowledge systems in addition to physical artifacts. Eridu's education would have included advanced mathematics for astronomical calculations, linguistic training in multiple writing systems, medical knowledge for healing rituals, and understanding of consciousness technologies for prophetic functions. The extensive training required for these positions indicates they involved genuine expertise rather than merely ceremonial roles. The verification of successful power transfer involved demonstration of functional capabilities rather than simple acceptance of claimed authority. The text describes how restored high priestesses performed specific rituals that produced observable results, including favorable omens, successful agricultural ceremonies, and accurate astronomical predictions. These demonstrations of competence confirmed that proper authority transfer had occurred, and that the office holder possessed both the knowledge and artifacts necessary for effective functioning. The implications of the exaltation extend beyond the specific historical circumstances of Enheduanna's restoration to office. The text establishes that religious and political authority in Mesopotamian civilization involved actual technological capabilities and specialized knowledge rather than purely symbolic or spiritual qualities. The systematic procedures for transferring these capabilities between office holders created institutional continuity that preserved essential knowledge and functions across changes in individual leadership. The myth of Enki and Ninhursag describes what appears to be genetic experimentation by divine beings, including the creation of beings with specific characteristics and the correction of genetic flaws through technological intervention. The text, preserved on tablets from Nippur, describes systematic breeding programs, biological engineering procedures, and the production of beings designed for particular functions, all presented in matter-of-fact language that suggests documentation of actual biological research programs. The composition known as Enki and Ninhursag survives primarily on a single well-preserved tablet excavated from Nippur and currently housed in the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. The text consists of approximately 270 lines describing Enki's activities in the mythical land of Dilmun, generally identified with Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, where he engaged in various creative and reproductive activities with the goddess Ninhursag and her descendants. The narrative begins with Dilmun described as a pure and pristine land lacking certain features necessary for sustained habitation. The text states that in Dilmun the raven uttered no cry, the lion killed not, and the wolf snatched not the lamb, indicating an environment without normal biological competition or predation. Enki's intervention transforms this sterile paradise into a productive environment through introduction of fresh water, establishment of agricultural systems, and implementation of normal biological processes. The reproductive sequence that follows describes systematic breeding experiments involving Enki and multiple goddess figures across several generations. The text details how Enki impregnated Ninhursag, then subsequently mated with their daughter Ninsa, then with the granddaughter Ninkura, and finally with the great-granddaughter Utu. This multi-generational breeding program produced offspring with increasingly specific characteristics, suggesting deliberate genetic manipulation rather than random reproduction. The plants that grew from the discarded semen of these unions possessed unusual properties that attracted Enki's attention. The text describes 8 specific plants arising in the experimental garden, each with distinct characteristics. Enki consumed these plants, described as tasting them to determine their properties, and subsequently became ill with afflictions affecting 8 different parts of his body. This experimentation with biologically active materials and the resulting physiological effects suggests systematic investigation of plant genetics and biochemistry. Ninhursag's response to Enki's illness involved creating 8 specific beings, each designed to cure one of his afflictions. The text provides detailed descriptions of these created beings, including their names, physical characteristics, and specific functions. Each being was precisely engineered to address a particular medical problem, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of the relationship between biological design and functional capability. The names given to these beings include Azimua for the jaw ailment, Ninti for the rib ailment, and similar specific designations for each created entity. The creation procedure for these therapeutic beings receives technical description that parallels the human creation accounts in other texts. Ninhursag pinched off portions of clay, mixed them with specific materials, and shaped them into beings with predetermined characteristics optimized for particular functions. The precision with which these beings fulfilled their designed purposes, each curing exactly the ailment for which it was created, demonstrates successful implementation of biological engineering principles. The genetic correction procedures described in the narrative indicate ability to identify specific biological problems and implement targeted solutions. The text's systematic approach to problem identification, solution design, implementation, and verification mirrors modern scientific methodology. The creation of beings specifically engineered to produce therapeutic substances or perform medical procedures represents sophisticated application of biotechnology principles. The experimental nature of these activities receives explicit acknowledgement in the text through references to trial and error, unexpected results, and iterative refinement of procedures. The narrative describes some creations as successful and others as requiring modification, indicating genuine experimentation rather than perfect divine omniscience. This presentation of divine beings as researchers, learning through systematic investigation, provides insight into how advanced technological societies might approach biological engineering. The ethical implications of genetic experimentation receive some attention through Ninhursag's anger at Enki's unauthorized consumption of the experimental plants. The text describes her initial refusal to help him despite his suffering, suggesting recognition that biological experimentation carried risks and required proper oversight. The eventual reconciliation and collaborative creation of therapeutic beings established protocols for responsible genetic engineering under appropriate supervision. The Sumerian agricultural manual, known as the Farmer's Instructions, preserves detailed technical knowledge about irrigation engineering, soil science, and crop management that exceeds what early Bronze Age societies should have developed independently. The text, dating to approximately 1700 BC but clearly based on much earlier sources, describes sophisticated understanding of hydrology, soil chemistry, and plant genetics that suggests instruction by sources with advanced scientific knowledge rather than gradual accumulation through trial and error. The Farmer's Instructions survives on multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period, with the most complete version preserved in the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. The text consists of approximately 110 lines of Sumerian, providing systematic guidance for all phases of the agricultural cycle, from initial field preparation through final harvest and storage. Unlike wisdom literature offering general advice, this composition reads as a technical manual containing precise specifications and detailed procedures. The opening sections address field selection and soil preparation, with attention to factors affecting agricultural productivity. The text instructs farmers to keep a sharp eye on the opening of the dikes and ditches, and to watch when water has been let into the field, demonstrating understanding that irrigation timing affects soil moisture levels and salinity. The manual specifies that fields should be ploughed in alternate years to prevent soil exhaustion, revealing knowledge of crop rotation principles and soil nutrient depletion. The irrigation specifications in the Farmer's Instructions include sophisticated hydraulic engineering principles. The text describes how to maintain proper water flow rates, prevent waterlogging through adequate drainage, and ensure uniform distribution across field surfaces. Instructions for calculating optimal irrigation volumes based on field size. Soil type and crop requirements demonstrate mathematical capabilities and empirical knowledge of plant water needs. The manual specifies that approximately 1,500 litres of water per hectare should be applied at specific growth stages, quantities that modern agricultural science recognises as appropriate for Mesopotamian climate and soil conditions. The soil treatment procedures described in the manual include applications of specific amendments to improve fertility and structure, The text mentions spreading manure, incorporating crop residues, and adding mineral materials to correct soil deficiencies. The timing and quantities of these amendments follow principles that align with modern understanding of soil chemistry and nutrient cycles. Instructions to plough fields multiple times before planting, allowing weathering periods between ploughing sessions, demonstrate understanding of how mechanical cultivation and exposure to air improve soil structure. The seed selection guidance reveals sophisticated knowledge of plant genetics and quality control. The manual instructs farmers to select seed only from the best portions of the previous harvest, to clean seed thoroughly to remove inferior grains and debris, and to treat seed with specific substances before planting to protect against diseases and pests. The text specifies optimal seeding rates calibrated to field conditions, with heavier seeding in poor soils and lighter rates in fertile fields, showing understanding of plant competition and resource availability. The planting procedures receive meticulous attention with specifications for furrow depth, seed spacing, and planting patterns. The manual describes using a seeder plough that simultaneously creates furrows and deposits seed at controlled rates. A technological innovation requiring sophisticated tool design and manufacturing capability. The text specifies that furrows should be made at uniform depths with consistent spacing between rows to ensure even germination and facilitate later cultivation operations. The crop management instructions address weed control, pest management, and disease prevention through integrated approaches combining mechanical, biological, and chemical methods. The text describes timing cultivation operations to disrupt weed growth cycles, employing birds to control insect pests, and applying herbal preparations to prevent fungal diseases. The manual specifies that fields should be inspected regularly and problems addressed immediately before they spread, demonstrating understanding of agricultural monitoring and early intervention principles. The harvest timing guidance shows sophisticated understanding of grain maturation processes and optimal harvest windows. The text instructs farmers to observe specific visual indicators including color changes, moisture content, and ease of kernel separation from chaff. The manual specifies that harvest should occur when grain reaches specific maturity stages, avoiding both premature cutting that reduces yields and delayed harvest that increases shattering losses. Instructions for organizing harvest labor, scheduling cutting and threshing operations, and managing transportation logistics reveal comprehensive planning capabilities. The storage procedures described in the farmer's instructions demonstrate understanding of grain preservation principles and pest control in stored products. The text specifies construction details for granaries including elevation above ground to prevent moisture intrusion, ventilation systems to maintain air circulation, and sealing techniques to exclude insects and rodents. Instructions for monitoring stored grain and implementing fumigation procedures when necessary show awareness of post-harvest management requirements. The mathematical calculations required for implementing the farmer's instructions include area measurements, volume calculations, rate determinations, and resource allocation optimizations. The text assumes familiarity with Sumerian mathematical systems, including base 60 arithmetic and geometric principles. The precision of quantities specified and the complexity of calculations required indicate that agricultural practice involved substantial mathematical expertise rather than simple rule-of-thumb methods. The lamentation text describing the destruction of Sumerian cities around 2000 BC preserve detailed accounts of catastrophic events that ended the Ur III period. These texts describe not just military conquest but environmental catastrophes, technological failures, and the withdrawal of divine protection that left cities vulnerable to collapse. The systematic nature of the destruction described and its correlation with geological and archaeological evidence of rapid climate change suggests these texts document actual catastrophic events rather than literary exaggeration. The most extensive of these lamentation compositions is the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, surviving on numerous tablets from the Old Babylonian period. The text consists of approximately 430 lines organized into 11 sections called kirugus, each describing different aspects of the catastrophe that destroyed the third dynasty of Ur around 2004 BC. The composition was not merely literary mourning but served ritual functions, being recited during temple ceremonies intended to prevent similar disasters from recurring. The opening sections of the Lamentation describe the divine decision to abandon the Sumerian cities, emphasizing that destruction resulted from withdrawal of divine protection rather than superior enemy military force. The text states that An pronounced the utter destruction of the city, and Enlil confirmed the destruction decree. This divine abandonment left cities vulnerable to forces they could not resist through human capabilities alone. The systematic nature of divine withdrawal across multiple cities simultaneously indicates coordinated decision rather than isolated local failures. The environmental catastrophes described in the Lamentation include severe drought, agricultural collapse, and water system failures that preceded military invasion. The text describes how the rivers brought no fresh water, how the fields produced no grain, and how the gardens bore no fruit. These agricultural failures occurred despite continued human maintenance efforts, suggesting that divine technological support previously sustained productivity beyond natural environmental limits. The withdrawal of this support exposed human populations to the full severity of deteriorating climate conditions. The technological failures documented in the Lamentation extend beyond agricultural systems to include breakdown of urban infrastructure. The text describes how city walls crumbled without being attacked, how gates collapsed spontaneously, and how buildings fell into ruin despite adequate construction. These structural failures suggest that divine oversight had maintained architectural integrity beyond what materials and construction techniques could naturally sustain. The simultaneous failure of infrastructure across multiple cities indicates systemic collapse rather than isolated incidents. The invasion by Elamite and other foreign forces receives description as the final stage of destruction rather than its primary cause. The Lamentation portrays these armies as instruments implementing divinely decreed destruction rather than independent military powers. The text states that the enemy was given the sweet south wind, indicating that even weather patterns favoured the invaders while working against defenders. This total environmental and military coordination against Sumerian cities suggests catastrophe on a scale exceeding normal warfare. The human suffering described in the Lamentation provides harrowing detail about population displacement, starvation, and social breakdown. The text describes mothers abandoning children they could no longer feed, families fragmenting as members fled in different directions seeking survival, and the breakdown of law and order as desperate populations competed for diminishing resources. The corpses filled the river channels and piled up in city streets, creating public health crises that compounded other disasters. The specific destruction of Ur receives extensive treatment in the later sections of the Lamentation. The text describes how the city's patron deity Nana abandoned his temple, how protective divine powers departed from the city gates, and how the urban population faced catastrophe without divine assistance. The description of Ur's fall includes precise details about which buildings burned, which walls collapsed, and which neighbourhoods suffered most severe damage, suggesting the composition preserved eyewitness testimony rather than invented literary details. Archaeological evidence from Ur and other Sumerian cities confirms the catastrophic destruction described in the Lamentation texts. Excavations conducted by Leonard Woolley at Ur reveal destruction layers dating to approximately 2004 BC, showing evidence of intense fire, violent demolition, and hasty abandonment. The archaeological record shows that the city was not gradually declining, but suffered sudden catastrophic collapse, consistent with the textual accounts of coordinated environmental and military disaster. Climate data from the period corroborates the Lamentation's descriptions of severe drought and agricultural collapse. Analysis of sediment cores from the Persian Gulf and Red Sea reveals dramatic reduction in rainfall across the ancient Near East beginning around 2100 BC and lasting for approximately 300 years. This severe aridification, known to modern climatologists as the 4.2 kiloyear event, caused widespread agricultural failure, population displacement, and political collapse throughout the region. The correlation between divine withdrawal, environmental catastrophe, and civilizational collapse described in the Lamentation text suggests that Sumerian urban civilization depended on technological and administrative support from divine beings that humans could not independently maintain. When this support ended, whether through deliberate divine decision or other causes, the complex urban system collapsed rapidly rather than adapting gradually to new conditions. The lamentation preserves not merely religious interpretation, but documentation of actual dependency relationships between divine administrators and human populations. The extensive composition describing Gudea's construction of Ningersu's temple at Lagash provides the most detailed account in ancient literature of divine beings, providing specific architectural and engineering guidance to human builders. The text, preserved on multiple cylinders dating to approximately 2100 BC, includes precise measurements, material specifications, astronomical alignments, and construction sequences that demonstrate access to advanced engineering knowledge and possibly direct supervision by technically sophisticated beings. The composition known as the Cylinders of Gudea survives on 2 large clay cylinders discovered at Tello, ancient Girsu, during French excavations in the late 19th century. Cylinder A contains approximately 1,300 lines of Sumerian text, while Cylinder B preserves an additional 1,200 lines, together forming the longest continuous narrative composition from ancient Mesopotamia. The physical cylinders themselves demonstrate sophisticated ceramic technology, with perfectly uniform walls, precisely inscribed characters, and chemical composition indicating advanced kiln control. The narrative begins with Gudea receiving the commission to build the Aninu temple through a complex dream sequence requiring expert interpretation. The text describes how Gudea consulted the goddess Nanshe, a specialist in dream interpretation, who decoded the symbolic imagery to reveal that Ningersu desired a new temple, built according to specific divine specifications. This consultation process emphasizes that temple construction required accurate understanding of divine requirements rather than human architectural preferences. The divine architectural plans revealed through the dream included presentation of a lapis lazuli tablet, inscribed with detailed building specifications. The text describes this plan as showing the ground plan of the temple, with precise measurements for foundation dimensions, wall heights, and chamber proportions. The use of lapis lazuli, an exotic stone imported from Afghanistan at great expense, as the medium for architectural drawings indicates these plans were intended as permanent reference documents rather than temporary construction sketches. The material procurement phase of construction demonstrates sophisticated logistics and international trade networks. The text describes Gudea sending expeditions to obtain cedar from the Amanus Mountains in Syria, diorite from Megan in Oman, carnelian from India, and gold from unknown distant sources. The quantities of materials specified and the distances travelled to obtain them reveal organisational capabilities and commercial connections spanning the entire ancient Near East. The coordination required to gather these diverse materials and transport them to Lagash indicates systematic planning and resource management. The construction workforce organisation receives detailed documentation revealing hierarchical management structures. The text describes Gudea assembling workers from throughout his territory and organising them into specialised teams. Master craftsmen supervised teams of stonecutters, brickmakers, carpenters, metalworkers, and other specialists. The text specifies that workers were provided with rations, tools, and supervision, demonstrating systematic labour management. The ability to coordinate thousands of workers across multiple years of construction indicates administrative sophistication comparable to major modern construction projects. The astronomical alignments incorporated into the temple design receive explicit documentation in the cylinders. The text describes how specific chambers were oriented toward the rising positions of particular stars and constellations. The foundation ceremony occurred when celestial conditions aligned properly, with the text noting the positions of Venus, the Moon, and specific stars at the moment construction commenced. These astronomical synchronizations required precise observational capabilities and mathematical calculations to implement correctly. The foundation rituals described in the cylinders involved more than symbolic ceremonies. The text details the placement of specific objects beneath foundation stones, including precious metals, inscribed tablets, and substances described as having protective properties. These foundation deposits were positioned according to precise geometric patterns aligned with astronomical directions. Archaeological excavation of Mesopotamian temple foundations has confirmed the presence of such deliberately placed deposits, matching textual descriptions. The construction sequence outlined in the cylinders demonstrates sophisticated understanding of engineering principles and structural mechanics. The text describes how foundations were laid to specific depths depending on soil conditions, how walls were constructed with precise dimensional tolerances, and how roof structures were supported through engineered beam systems. The attention to load distribution, material stress limits, and structural integrity reveals knowledge of engineering principles that should not have been available to early Bronze Age builders through empirical experimentation alone. The quality control procedures implemented during construction included dimensional verification, material testing, and structural inspection at each building phase. The text describes how Gudea personally inspected work at regular intervals, how master craftsmen verified that specifications were followed precisely, and how defective work was identified and corrected immediately. This systematic approach to construction quality demonstrates understanding that temple functionality depended on precise implementation of divine specifications rather than approximate adherence to general guidelines. The temple activation ceremonies described upon completion involved elaborate procedures designed to establish the structure's communication capabilities and divine presence. The text details purification rituals, installation of sacred furnishings, and performance of specific ceremonies that would enable the temple to serve its intended purposes. These activation procedures treated the temple as functional technology, requiring proper initialization rather than merely symbolic religious architecture. The myth of Ninurta and the turtle contains encoded references to the control of natural forces through technological means, describing devices and procedures that enabled divine beings to manipulate water flow, reshape landscapes, and harness geological energies for construction and agricultural purposes. The text, while cast in mythological form, preserves technical information about hydraulic engineering, geological modification, and environmental management that early Mesopotamian civilization appears to have inherited, rather than independently developed. The composition known as Ninurta and the turtle survives on tablets from the Old Babylonian period discovered at Nippur and other sites. The narrative describes Ninurta's conflict with various enemies, including the stones of the mountains, and his ultimate confrontation with a turtle that defeats him through cunning rather than strength. The mythological framework contains detailed descriptions of technologies and procedures that reveal sophisticated understanding of natural forces and their manipulation. The opening sections describe Ninurta's organization of natural resources following military victories over chaotic forces. The text details how Ninurta assigned specific functions to different types of stone, determining which would be suitable for construction, which would serve agricultural purposes, and which would provide precious materials for specialized applications. This systematic classification and functional assignment of geological materials demonstrates comprehensive knowledge of mineralogy and materials science. The water control technologies attributed to Ninurta include sophisticated hydraulic engineering capabilities. The text describes how he gathered the waters in mountain regions and directed them toward agricultural plains through constructed channels and control structures. The description includes technical details about dam construction, using specific materials arranged in particular configurations to withstand water pressure. The text mentions the use of bitumen and stones to create waterproof barriers, techniques that archaeological evidence confirms were employed in Mesopotamian hydraulic engineering. The landscape modification procedures described in the myth involve moving massive quantities of earth and stone to reshape terrain for human use. The text describes Ninurta piling up mountains, creating valleys, and leveling plains according to systematic plans. While presented in mythological terms as the actions of a powerful deity, these descriptions may preserve memories of large-scale earth-moving projects that transformed the Mesopotamian landscape. Archaeological evidence reveals that ancient Mesopotamian cities required massive earthworks for foundations, defensive walls, and irrigation infrastructure. The harnessing of geological energies mentioned in the text includes references to technologies that utilized natural forces for construction and agricultural purposes. The narrative describes methods for splitting stone using natural fracture patterns, techniques for moving heavy materials using water pressure and buoyancy, and procedures for stabilizing soil through controlled flooding and drainage cycles. These technologies demonstrate sophisticated understanding of physics and geology applied to practical engineering challenges. The turtle that ultimately defeats Ninurta represents an interesting inversion of the power relationships typically portrayed in Mesopotamian mythology. The text describes how this small creature uses intelligence and knowledge of Ninurta's vulnerabilities to overcome the warrior god's physical strength. This narrative element may encode information about how advanced knowledge can overcome superior force, suggesting that the technologies attributed to divine beings depended on specialized understanding rather than mere power. The specific vulnerability exploited by the turtle involves knowledge of Ninurta's dependence on particular conditions or equipment for maintaining his capabilities. The text describes the turtle creating circumstances that neutralize Ninurta's advantages, forcing him to operate without his normal technological support. This may preserve information about the conditional nature of divine powers and their dependence on specific technologies or environmental conditions rather than intrinsic supernatural abilities. The resolution of the conflict involves Enki's intervention, providing knowledge that enables Ninurta to escape the turtle's trap. This introduction of additional divine knowledge to solve the problem emphasizes that technological capabilities in Mesopotamian tradition depended on accumulated wisdom and specialized understanding. The text portrays divine beings as possessing superior knowledge rather than magical powers, consistent with interpretations of ancient gods as technologically advanced beings rather than supernatural entities. The environmental management principles encoded in the myth include sustainable resource use, ecological balance, and long-term planning. The text describes Ninurta organizing natural systems to provide ongoing benefits rather than merely extracting immediate resources. The assignment of specific functions to different materials and the systematic organization of water resources demonstrate comprehensive environmental planning aimed at creating self-sustaining systems. The composition describing Ninurta's triumphant return to Nippur after defeating various enemies provides documentation of how knowledge, technology, and authority were centralized in specific locations under divine oversight. The text describes the transportation of precious materials, captured technologies, and accumulated wisdom to central repositories where they could be preserved and controlled, consistent with the archaeological evidence of temple complexes serving as libraries, laboratories, and administrative centers. The narrative known as the Return of Ninurta to Nippur exists in fragmentary form on tablets from multiple sites, dating to the Old Babylonian period. The composition describes Ninurta bringing tribute and spoils from his military campaigns to the Ekur temple at Nippur, the religious center of Sumerian civilization and earthly seat of his father Enlil. The text emphasizes the centralization of resources and knowledge as essential for maintaining cosmic order and civilizational stability. The catalogue of materials transported to Nippur includes exotic stones, rare metals, and unusual substances from distant regions. The text provides detailed lists specifying quantities, qualities, and sources for each material type. These inventories reveal comprehensive knowledge of geological resources throughout the ancient Near East, and systematic programs for acquiring and concentrating valuable materials at central locations. The precision of these lists mirrors actual temple inventory text excavated from Mesopotamian sites. The captured technologies mentioned in the narrative include devices, tools, and implements seized from defeated enemies. The text describes these items as possessing special capabilities or requiring expert knowledge for proper operation. The centralization of these technologies at Nippur prevented their misuse by unqualified individuals while ensuring their preservation for authorized applications. This concern for controlling access to advanced technologies suggests they represented genuine capabilities rather than symbolic religious objects. The accumulated wisdom brought to Nippur includes written texts, oral traditions, and specialized knowledge systems from conquered territories. The narrative describes how Ninurta gathered the learning of different peoples and deposited it in the Ekur temple library. This systematic collection of knowledge from diverse sources created comprehensive repositories that preserved information that might otherwise be lost through political upheaval or cultural change. The organizational structure of these central repositories receives detailed attention in the text. The narrative describes specialized storage facilities for different material types, controlled access systems preventing unauthorized entry, and trained personnel responsible for maintaining and cataloging collections. These descriptions match archaeological evidence from temple complexes showing dedicated storage chambers, security features, and administrative systems for managing accumulated resources and knowledge. The ritual procedures for formally transferring materials and knowledge to divine control involved elaborate ceremonies establishing proper custody and authorization. The text describes how Ninurta presented each category of tribute to Enlil, receiving formal acceptance and assignment of storage locations and authorized uses. These ceremonial transfers created legal records establishing divine ownership and human custodianship of valuable resources and technologies. The educational functions of centralized knowledge repositories receive emphasis through descriptions of how temple scribes and priests accessed collected materials for study and training. The text mentions systematic programs for copying important texts, analyzing exotic materials, and experimenting with captured technologies under supervised conditions. These activities transform temples into research and educational institutions in addition to their religious functions. The security measures protecting centralized repositories included physical barriers, access control procedures, and protective curses threatening those who might violate sacred storage areas. Archaeological investigation of temple complexes has revealed elaborate locking mechanisms, hidden chambers, and defensive architectural features designed to prevent unauthorized access. Inscriptions warning against theft or damage of temple property demonstrate serious concerns about protecting accumulated resources. The distribution systems for controlled release of resources and knowledge from central repositories enabled systematic support of authorized projects throughout the civilization. The text describes how materials and information were allocated to qualified recipients for approved purposes while preventing wasteful or dangerous applications. This centralized control enabled efficient resource management while maintaining quality standards and preventing proliferation of dangerous technologies. The hymns to Enlil from the late Sumerian period contain subtle references to changing relationships between divine beings and human civilization, describing a transition from direct governance to remote oversight. These texts, dating to the final centuries of Sumerian civilization around 1900 BC, suggest that the beings who had established and directly administered early Mesopotamian cities were gradually withdrawing from active involvement, leaving behind knowledge systems, administrative structures, and trained human intermediaries to maintain civilization independently. The corpus of Enlil hymns includes numerous compositions spanning several centuries of Sumerian literary development. The later hymns from the Ur-3 and Isin-Lhasa periods show subtle but significant shifts in how divine-human relationships are described compared to earlier texts. These changes in religious language reflect actual transformations in how divine beings interacted with human populations during the final phases of direct Anunnaki involvement. The earlier Enlil hymns describe immediate divine presence and direct communication between gods and humans. These texts portray Enlil as actively governing from the Eka temple, making daily decisions about human affairs and communicating regularly with kings and priests. The language emphasizes proximity, accessibility, and ongoing involvement in routine administrative matters. Divine commands are described as being delivered directly with immediate implementation expected. The later hymns introduce language suggesting increasing distance between divine and human spheres. These texts describe Enlil as remote, communicating through intermediaries rather than directly, and delegating routine decisions to subordinate divine administrators or human representatives. The language shifts from describing immediate presence to emphasizing cosmic transcendence. Divine will is described as being conveyed through dreams, omens, and symbolic communications requiring expert interpretation rather than clear direct instruction. The transition in temple protocols described in these hymns reveals systematic changes in how humans accessed divine guidance. Earlier texts describe priests entering divine presence chambers for direct consultation. Later hymns describe increasingly elaborate preparation procedures, intermediary protocols, and uncertainty about whether divine presence would manifest during ceremonies. This growing uncertainty suggests that direct divine manifestation became less reliable or frequent during the later Sumerian period. The emphasis on written records and preserved teachings in later hymns indicates growing dependence on accumulated knowledge rather than ongoing divine instruction. These texts describe the importance of studying ancient tablets, consulting established precedents, and following traditional procedures recorded by earlier generations. The shift from direct consultation to textual scholarship suggests that fresh divine input became less available, requiring greater reliance on preserved wisdom. the description of human intermediaries assuming greater responsibility for maintaining civilizational functions appears increasingly prominent in later hymns. These texts describe kings and high priests making independent decisions previously attributed to direct divine command. The language emphasizes human judgment, wisdom gained through experience, and responsibility for consequences rather than simply implementing divine directives. The references to divine departure or withdrawal, while subtle and often symbolic, become more frequent in the latest Sumerian hymns. These texts describe gods departing to distant cosmic regions, returning to celestial homes, or reducing their earthly presence. While maintaining reverence and devotion to these departed beings, the hymns acknowledge practical changes in how civilization functioned without constant divine supervision. The implications of these textual shifts for understanding Mesopotamian history suggest that the Anunnaki administrative presence described in earlier texts gradually diminished during the 3rd millennium BC. The beings who had established Sumerian cities and provided direct technological and administrative guidance implemented a planned withdrawal that transferred responsibility to trained human populations. The system proved partially successful, with Mesopotamian civilization continuing for millennia after direct Anunnaki involvement ended, though never fully recovering the technological sophistication or administrative efficiency described in the earliest texts. The evidence presented throughout this investigation reveals a profound challenge to conventional understanding of human civilizational development. The first written stories in human history do not describe gradual human innovation and cultural evolution, but instead document systematic instruction by advanced beings who established urban civilization through deliberate technological transfer and administrative organization. The consistency of these accounts across hundreds of texts spanning millennia, their matter-of-fact bureaucratic tone, and their correlation with archaeological anomalies that conventional theories struggle to explain all point toward preservation of genuine historical memories rather than mythological invention. The Sumerian creation narratives describe human origins not through divine spiritual blessing, but through biological engineering procedures involving genetic material transfer and systematic breeding programs. The technical precision of these accounts, including specific numbers of created beings, gestation periods, and inherited characteristics, reads like laboratory documentation rather than religious poetry. The antediluvian king lists record impossibly long reigns using precise mathematical calculations based on astronomical cycles, suggesting these figures represent actual time measurements using systems we no longer fully understand. The Apkallu traditions describe amphibious beings emerging from the Persian Gulf to teach primitive humans the complete package of civilizational technologies, appearing suddenly with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and urban planning fully developed. The agricultural and architectural knowledge preserved in texts like the Farmer's Instructions and the Cylinders of Gudea demonstrate understanding of soil science, hydraulic engineering, astronomical alignments, and materials science that exceed what Bronze Age populations should have achieved through independent experimentation. The systematic organization of economic activities described in texts like Enki and the World Order portrays civilization not as organically evolving, but as deliberately designed and implemented according to comprehensive plans. The Lamentation literature documents catastrophic collapse when divine technological and administrative support was withdrawn, suggesting that early Mesopotamian civilization depended on ongoing external assistance rather than operating through fully independent human capabilities. The pattern that emerges from these earliest written records describes a cycle of civilizational rise under divine guidance, human dependence on advanced technological support, and catastrophic collapse when that support ended. The gradual divine withdrawal documented in later Sumerian texts left behind knowledge systems, trained intermediaries, and institutional structures that enabled partial continuation of civilization, though at reduced sophistication levels compared to the golden age of direct divine administration. The preservation of this knowledge through temple libraries, mystery schools, and hereditary priesthoods created underground streams of ancient wisdom that influenced subsequent civilizations long after Sumer itself had vanished. For contemporary humanity, these ancient accounts suggest that we may not be the first technological civilization to develop on Earth, but rather the latest in a recurring pattern of advancement, collapse, and renewal. The technologies we consider modern innovations might represent rediscovery of capabilities that previous civilizations achieved through different pathways, whether through their own development or through instruction by the same advanced beings who established Sumerian civilization. The question that emerges from examining humanity's oldest written stories is not whether we are alone in the universe, but whether we have ever truly been alone on Earth, and what responsibilities come with the knowledge that our origins may involve deliberate design rather than accidental evolution. As we develop capabilities approaching those described in ancient texts, including genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and potential contact with non-human intelligences, the wisdom preserved in these earliest written stories may provide essential guidance for navigating challenges that destroyed previous civilizations and determining whether this iteration of human development will transcend the cyclical pattern or repeat the catastrophes documented in our oldest memories.